There are many things in the administration's proposals that I agree with. The increased penalties for computer hacking, the notification law, the clearer cybersecurity authority for DHS, the FISMA reforms, which I think are necessary. So I would have to say overall, I think Howard Schmidt, did a pretty good job. But the one area where I find myself in disagreement really relates to the private sector and what role the government plays in regulating the private sector. I think the first principle that we have, particularly in this area in Congress, is to do no harm. And I think we can legislate and have unintended consequences, particularly as it applies to the private sector. We can harden the federal networks, and I think that's something we're very focused on. I know the Einstein 3, there are a lot of things in this proposal that deal with that. But it's really hardening the private sector and the critical infrastructures in the private sector that I think are the greatest challenge for us as policymakers. 90% of the critical infrastructures up to are really controlled by the private sector. And so my first question is to you, Mr. Clinton. How can we enhance that and incentivize the private sector without having these punitive mandates? The one thing in this proposal I disagree with is the regulating over the private sector. And then if they're out of, the remedy for a violation is basically what we call name and shame. We'll call out the company and then publicly call out the vulnerability, which I don't think that's very good policy to be, publicly showing where a company is vulnerable. That just invites more mischief. Give me your thoughts on the regulating part of this provision, and what would you recommend?
Well, certainly I agree with you, Mr. McCaul, about the disclosure aspects here. It creates a target. Not only that, it creates an incentive for companies not to find out things. We need to incentivize people to be doing a better job reviewing their cyber systems. The modern cyber threat is geared around not allowing you to know that it's there. A few years ago, cyber threats, were big cutesy names like the love bug and blaster and all that kind of thing. Modern cyber threats are stealthy. They get in your system, and the first thing they do is clean out your system so that when there's detection done, none of these lousy cyber threats let you know that the really bad guy is there. They go in your system and they hide. So it's very difficult to find these guys. So we want to provide incentives for people to go and look at them. If the corporation knows that the harder they look for a problem, the more likely they are going to be named and shamed for finding it. We've created exactly the wrong incentives. It would be much better if companies were proactively incented in the way that I suggested with Ms. Clark, so that they wanted to go find these things because they were going to lower their liability, they were going to lower their insurance rate, they were going to have a better chance at a federal contract, et cetera, et cetera. The one point that I think we have to be sure, though, is that we don't assume that there's some sort of minimum national standard that everybody has to get to. That's not true. The problem that we have with cybersecurity is not that the technology is broken and so we have to bring it up to standard. The problem with cybersecurity is that it is being attacked from the outside. And so we have to find a way to motivate a continual investigation and innovation of mechanisms rather than bring people up to some sort of stable standard.
Thank you. My time's limited. Ms. Hathaway, I wanted to ask you a quick question. You have a lot of expertise in these public-private partnerships. We've had the ISACs, the Information Sharing Analysis Centers, have never really gotten to the point where we want them to be. When I met with some of these firms in Silicon Valley, they talked about the liability protections. There is a FOIA exemption or exception for critical infrastructures in terms of the sharing, but there still isn't any liability protection for them, so they're not incentivized to share information. Can you speak to that, and what would be your recommendation as to how we can better enhance these public-private partnerships?
Representative McCaul, I agree that many companies perceive that the FOIA is not strong enough if it were actually leveraged, and therefore private sector entities are not as willing to share information. I think that the question we need to be asking ourselves on the government side is how can we share more and better information with the private sector so they can appreciate the threat that they're dealing with and the exposure that they have as multinational corporations. I think the government does not share actionable information with the private sector and should increase their information sharing mechanisms that are informed from the law enforcement and the intelligence community. DHS, as the forward-facing entity, needs better information from the law enforcement and intelligence community and should be sharing actionable information and real case studies with the private sector of what's happening in their industry, how certain corporations are being exposed, not necessarily naming them, but saying company X was exposed with the following breach and lost X quantity of confidential information. It's only when we start using real cases and real information that the private sector will be able to better defend itself.
Thank you, Ms. Hathaway.